Hello, Pod A students. Today we are going to talk about Chapter 10 concerning political campaigns and elections. So elections are a regular feature of our country's political system. We actually have more elections to elect more office holders than any other nation in the world. And that emphasis on elections really comes from the constitutional principle of popular sovereignty. So one of the most important things to the framers was this idea of popular sovereignty and giving the power and authority to the people. And what a better way to exercise that authority than by voting. So even though most Americans feel that voting in an election is a crucial part of citizenship, there's a large percentage of Americans that don't vote on a regular basis. And there's been many situations throughout history where Americans have been denied voting rights. And you can see some of the groups that have been denied rights to vote throughout the years represented on this slide. So the right to vote has really only been won after years of struggle, and we're going to talk about some of the amendments that helped improve the right to vote and allow the right to vote for many groups that had been kept from voting for a long period of time. So we start with the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment advanced the principle of universal male suffrage. So the amendment was ratified in 1870, and it granted voting rights to all male citizens, including African Americans. Early in the 20th century, there are several other measures that are passed to expand voting rights. The 17th Amendment allowed for direct election of senators. Up until that point, senators were elected by the state legislature. And then we have the 19th Amendment approved in 1920 that extends the right to vote to all women. For many African Americans, the expansion of suffrage after the Civil War was pretty short-lived. For close to 100 years, really, many states, especially in the South, found ways to deny suffrage to African Americans in spite of the 15th Amendment. There were several legal barriers that would be put in place by states, things like poll taxes and literacy tests that were keeping African Americans from voting. So during the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s and 1960s, voting rights was one of the key goals of the movement. There were protests, and they achieved their first victory with the ratification of the 24th Amendment in 1964. So the 24th Amendment banned the use of poll taxes, which were kept again to discourage or kept many poor African Americans from voting. The second major advance comes with the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So this particular act protected the voting rights of African Americans by banning literacy tests. So there were parts of the South where there were laws during voter registration or the process of signing up to vote that would keep certain groups of people, if they couldn't pass a literacy test, that they would not be allowed to vote. So the result of the Voting Rights Act, the number of African American voters increases dramatically in the South. So you have included a whole nother group of voters that wasn't being included before. If we go back to our chart on the voting amendments, you can see that the 26th Amendment, which was ratified in 1971, lowers the voting age to 18. So up until this point, typically states required voters to be at least 21 years old, and this amendment was adopted during debate over the Vietnam War. You had a lot of people arguing that if 18-year-old young men were sacrificing their lives in fighting for this war, had been drafted and sent into battle, that they should be old enough to vote. So we see the voting age change to 18. When we talk about voting today, there are 4 basic requirements to be able to vote in the United States. So these are the 4 things that you need to know. In all states, you need to be a U.S. citizen, you need to be at least 18 years old, you need to reside in the state that you were voting in, and you need to be a registered voter. When you register to vote, you're essentially filling out a form that is asking for basic information like your address and your date of birth. The goal is to confirm that you are 18 years of age and that you do reside where you are voting. So when it comes to voting and registering to vote in Minnesota, you are fortunate to live in a state that makes it very, very easy. to register to vote. The form is very simple. It's a one-page application. You can see it here. There's online voter registration. It's basically asking for those 4 requirements that you just talked about. Are you a U.S. citizen? Will you be 18 on or before the next election? What's your name? Where do you live? What's your date of birth? Any updates? You can, if you have a Minnesota driver's license, you can prove your identification that way. You can include your social security number. When you register, you can, if you want to register in person on the day of the election, that is allowed in Minnesota. You could bring your ID with you. If you don't have an ID, you can actually bring someone in to vouch for you, or you can bring a piece of mail that demonstrates your address. The main concern when registering is, again, that address. You vote where you live. Voting is very, very much tied to your address. So they need to be able to prove that you live where you say that you live, that you are who you say you are, and that you live there, and that you are 18 years of age. Otherwise, it's really that simple, a one-page document. You can mail it in advance, or like I said, in the state of Minnesota, you can register on election day, which is a huge advantage to opening up the opportunity to vote. When you go in to vote, you will see a ballot that looks something like this. You'll go in, you'll give them your name, they'll find you in the register book, you will sign your name next to your name and address so no one else can get a ballot. Everybody only gets one. They will hand you a ballot. This is the ballot from 2016. This is from Hennepin County, Minnesota. I couldn't find one for Washington County, but you can see there's federal offices listed here. You've got your U.S. representatives, so U.S. House of Representative members. If there is a state office running, a state senator, county offices. If there's any constitutional amendment on the ballot, there's often judges, other positions. Every position that's up for re-election at that time period will be on this ballot. This is what the state of Minnesota's ballot looks like. It tells you to vote, completely fill in the ovals next to your candidate's name. It shows you how to fill it in. It's basically like a Scantron. You take your marker and you fill in the bubble next to the candidate of your choice. You should only be picking one from each category. If you choose more than one, your vote doesn't get counted. If you make X's or circles or different marks on it, that your vote will most likely not be counted. You want to fill in that bubble just like you do on a Scantron. When you're finished, you bring it up, you put it in the voting machine, and you get your little I voted sticker. So when we talk about the nomination process, how do we get to the point of an election? How do we choose candidates for public office, and how do we go through that nomination process? There are lots of candidates for elective office in the United States. Typically, the candidate with the highest vote total wins. We use the popular vote for all positions of government except for president. Okay, we'll come back to the Electoral College a little bit later. And for most national or state offices, candidates must compete for their party's nomination in a primary election. So when you hear about primary elections, our next one is coming up on March 3rd, I believe. Voters determine their political party's nominee for an elective office. So you're going in and you are casting your ballot to determine who's going to be the nominee for the Democrat or the Republican Party. If you win that election, you go on to face the nominees of the other party, your opposition, in a general election. That would be held later on. General elections are held in November, and that's when voters choose among candidates from different parties to actually fill the office. So this one comes first. It's a primary. You're determining your nominees. Then you'll get to the general election in November. Those nominees are on the ballot, like the one we just showed you, and you will vote for the person that's actually going to take office. There are different versions, kind of going back to this primary election piece, there's different types of primaries. This is something that's left up to the states to decide. And primary elections, interestingly enough, are pretty common in the US, but they're very rare in the rest of the world. So primary elections, again, the idea is to kind of be a selection process out in the open and having party members participate, or even people that aren't party members, depending on what type of primary it is. So we'll start with open primaries. States with an open primary allow all voters to vote in primary elections. So in this system, voters decide which party primary to vote in on election day. Independent voters like the system because it allows them to participate in the primary of their choice. Usually, again, the purpose is to help nominate the candidate from their own party. When you look at a state with a closed primary, these states limit voting to registered party members. So you have to be a registered Democrat or a Republican if you live in a state with closed primaries. Independents are not allowed to participate. So in some states, voters may declare their party affiliation on election day and vote in that party's primary, but in general, party leaders prefer a closed primary because it's limiting the vote to that party faithful. They believe that those are the people that are going to, again, turn out to vote in the general election. So some politicians prefer the closed primary over the open primary. So primaries versus caucuses. I'm going to give you a quick description, but there is a great video here that you can find on Moodle or through this link to look at the main differences between primary and caucuses. But essentially, there are some states that have both a primary and a caucus for presidential elections. The primary or a direct primary is an election. You go in, you elect candidates to represent the political party in a general election. You fill out a ballot. A caucus, okay, which you'll be hearing about caucuses coming up too. New Hampshire and Ohio are both very famous for their caucuses. A caucus is more like a meeting. There are registered political party members that get together. They talk about candidates. They talk about platform issues. So it's a little bit more of an informal situation. They cast their ballots on pieces of paper and basically just have kind of a general discussion amongst affiliated party members. The primary is going to be an actual election with a ballot. Ballots get counted, etc. In Minnesota, we have primaries. We no longer have a caucus for presidential elections. So although voters don't need to identify a political party in our open primary elections, they're only allowed to vote for candidates from one political party. So for example, if you want to vote for one of the Republican candidates for the U.S. Senate race, you can't vote for a Democratic candidate for the U.S. House. So when you go in, you pick your person. You don't have to be a registered party member, but once you vote for one of the parties, it's straight ticket voting the rest of the way down. If you vote for multiple political parties on the primary ballot, your ballot will be rejected. So when we talk about election dates and campaigning, there's several different steps to the campaign. Most of which you see the television ads, you see campaign speeches, you see debates that are held on television, you see all of those different steps in that nomination process, and then we get down to the actual general election. So once primary season ends, the candidates who've won the party's nomination have to get into that campaigning for that general election. So there's 3 types of general elections in the U.S. We have presidential, midterm, and off-year elections. Presidential elections are held every 4 years on even numbered years. This is when we elect the president and the vice president, 1/3 of the Senate, and all members of the House. There may also be state and local officials on those ballots as well. Midterm elections are on the even numbered years between those presidential elections. So we are coming up on 2020. That is a presidential election year. In 2022 will be our next midterm election. During midterm elections, you've got 1/3 of the Senate, all members of the House, and again, some state and local officials. Off-year elections are elections that are held in those odd-numbered years. So typically you see more city positions, county supervisors, city mayors, city council, different boards of special districts. One thing to pay close attention to here is this election date. All elections, presidential and midterm elections, are on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November of even-numbered years. Have to know this for the test. Very important. And then when we talk about voter turnout tends to be lower in midterm elections than in presidential elections. So if you look at the graph, and this is from your books, you can take a further look there, but turnout in those off-year elections is even lower. So you can see presidential elections always have a little bit higher voter turnout, lower in midterm elections, the presidential election really gets people out to vote. Some factors that might impact that voting are here. We do have different ballots from state to state. Our elections are held during the workday, just some complicated things.